Right, hello everybody. Thanks so much for being here this morning. So I will be discussing the important role of nutrition in the gut-brain connection. I've specifically been interested in how the health of our guts impacts our mental health and if altering what goes on in our intestinal tract can change our thoughts and behavior. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. If a couple of you want to answer, up to you, but I'm wondering, what is an example of something that you've experienced where you've seen kind of this communication between your belly and your brain or vice versa? Anybody want to share? Yes.
After Thanksgiving.
Tell me about that. What is it? Do you experience kind of an emotion with that or just fullness?
Yeah, absolute fullness before you just keep eating until you.
I hear you.
Okay.
Anyone else have thoughts on this? Right?
Being angry,
Yes. Yes. Okay. Anybody else get that if they realize they're kind of irritable and then they realize, well, I haven't eaten? Yeah. Yes. Anybody ever get like nervous or lose their appetite or something before a presentation, for example? I definitely get that. So, all right. So today I am hoping to uncover some of the less obvious connections between the gut and the brain and leave you with a better understanding of how dietitians can care for those with mental health issues. All right. So why this topic? Well, mental disorders are very common. 1 in 5 individuals have a mental disorder. And according to the World Health Organization, depression is a leading cause of disability worldwide. So that is kind of a staggering statistic, I think. Okay, and then for my presentation today, I will be going over how mental illnesses are diagnosed and treated, the impact of dietary patterns and nutrition on mental health, the gut-brain axis, current research about the role of diet and psychobiotics in the gut-brain axis. And psychobiotic is a term used to describe living bacteria that are beneficial to mental health. It's kind of a newer term. It was coined in 2013. And then we'll look at the significance of this research and other takeaways. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's otherwise known as the DSM. Some of you may have heard of this. It outlines the criteria for diagnosis of a mental disorder. Health professionals use this to classify and diagnose. Here are your standard treatments. Probably seen these before. Medication, psychotherapy, and in some cases hospitalization. Thankfully, these treatments exist and they can improve quality of life for many people. But the problem is that mental illnesses are increasing and these treatments aren't always available, affordable, or effective. Our American diet might not be helping this issue. So according to extensive epidemiological data, the Western diet or the American diet is linked to impaired cognitive function and a higher risk for developing mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. Whereas dietary patterns similar to the Mediterranean diet have been linked to improved cognitive function and lower risk for developing these mental problems. Let's look at what we do know about nutrition's role in neuropsychiatric health. This might be review for a lot of you, but maybe some new stuff too. So neurotransmitter production requires specific nutrient precursors and cofactors. For example, tryptophan, an essential amino acid, is required for serotonin production. And phenylalanine and tyrosine are required for the production of dopamine and norepinephrine. And then we need B vitamins, among other things, to aid in this production. Inflammation is increased in mood disorders, and mitochondrial damage and oxidative stress are implicated in neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. And we know that there's some nutrients that help protect against oxidative stress and help promote normal brain function, such as vitamins C and E, omega-3 fatty acids, selenium and zinc, as well as many phytonutrients, such as flavonoids. These have protective effects. We also know that nutrition interacts with our genes. and that the quality of the diet we're exposed to in early life can be associated with mental health outcomes. And finally, the gut microbiota play a crucial role in the bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain, which I'll discuss shortly. And the food we eat impacts this gut microbiota. Again, possibly a review for a lot of you, but I just want to go over the functions of the gut. So the functions of the gut is largely absorption of nutrients and excretion of waste. And within the intestinal lining, which you may recall is a single layer of epithelial cells, within the layer are the enterocytes, which are the basic makeup of the lining, but there's also enteroendocrine cells, which produce hormones involved in things like digestion and appetite. And then on top of this layer is mucus, which hosts the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome are the trillions of bacteria and their genetics. And these have a variety of functions as well, which I'll talk about. So the gut-brain axis is the bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. And the gut and the brain communicate through two means: circulation, or the bloodstream, which is pictured there on the left on the bottom, and the nervous system, which is pictured on the top, or noted on the top there, the left image. And the gut microbiome is involved in all of these pathways. So one thing to keep in mind is that the majority of our immune system is in our gut, and our brain is susceptible to changes in the immune system, and long-term activation of this system can lead to inflammation of the brain. Much of our neurotransmitter production also happens in the gut, and microbes produce these neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. Microbes also stimulate the vagus nerve, which is pictured there on the right. Have any of you heard of the vagus nerve before? Okay, so it's this long cranial nerve that branches down into various organs, including the gut. And it's part of our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system. And the direction of communication happens in both ways, and the majority of communication is actually sent from the gut to the brain. So the microbiome is actually needed for all of these things. Okay, there are reasons to think that a healthy gut is a foundation for a healthy brain. Meta-analyses have suggested gut microbiota disturbances in major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, and anxiety. And dysbiosis is essentially where there is either a lack of beneficial bacteria, anti-inflammatory bacteria, or an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, or just an overall lack of diversity. The question that I think we should ask is, can we use nutrition and psychobiotics to treat or prevent mental health disorders? And when you hear psychobiotics, think of probiotics or prebiotics, which are the food for beneficial bacteria. The first study we will look at did not look at the microbiota in the context of mental health, but it did look at diet's effects on the immune system. This research was done in California and was published in 2021. Stanford researchers asked this question: will a diet high in fermented foods or fiber modulate the gut microbiome and reduce inflammatory markers? Those included in the study were generally healthy adults, and they had to provide written informed consent. Some exclusion criteria included having a history of active, uncontrolled inflammatory bowel disease or other disease comorbidities such as diabetes or renal disease, or having an already high dietary intake of fiber or fermented foods. This was a prospective randomized trial. 39 individuals were allocated into either a high fiber group or a high fermented food diet group, and after 17 weeks, 36 were analyzed. The number was even between groups. Participants in both groups were encouraged to increase their consumption of their respective diets during a 4-week ramp phase, and then maintain high levels of those foods during a 6-week maintenance phase. And then during a 4-week choice phase, they could follow the diet to their desired extent. Stool samples were assessed for microbiota composition and function, and blood samples were assessed for measures of immune function, such as cytokine activity. Each participant met with a dietitian throughout the intervention, who would assess compliance and give them recommendations for increasing the amount of their respective foods into their diet. The high fiber intervention was encouraged to increase their fiber consumption by 20 grams, which is kind of a lot, but they managed to do this. So at the end of the maintenance phase, they were consuming an average of 45 grams. Fiber sources were fruits, vegetables, legumes, grains, nuts, and seeds. The high fermented food intervention was advised to increase to 6 servings by the end of the maintenance phase, and they successfully did this. Examples of a serving were 6 ounces of kefir, kombucha, or yogurt, 2 ounces of a vegetable brine drink, or a 1/4 cup of fermented veggies, which would be sauerkraut, kimchi, and things like that. The most significant outcomes occurred in the high fermented food group. So this group saw an increase in microbiome diversity, along with a decrease in inflammatory signaling. Participants in this group reported bloating during the ramp phase, but this subsided over time. And then those in the high fiber intervention reported increased stool softness from baseline to endpoint. They did not see an increase in microbial diversity. However, they did see an increase in something called microbiome encoded cazymes, which are enzymes that help digest complex carbohydrates. And they also had personalized immune responses, and I'll discuss that part on this next slide here. So participants in the fiber group responded to the intervention differently. Some experienced lower activation of their immune system or lower inflammation, which is noted by the orange and the blue on that left table, and some experienced higher activation and higher inflammation, which is noted by the red. And what the ASVs on the left-hand side of the table are amplicon sequence variants, and that basically just describes microbial diversity. So, and this was at baseline, so the higher inflammation category or group had lower microbial diversity at baseline compared to the other groups there. And then in the figure on the right there, the high fermented food group had an increase in microbial diversity, and it reached its peak during the choice phase, which is the box last phase there. And this suggests that there might have been some gut ecosystem remodeling and colonization occurring at that time. I gave the study a neutral rating for being neither exceptionally strong or weak. Some weaknesses were that there was a small sample size. There wasn't a control group. They just used between and within group differences to assess the results. It was a difficult intervention to replicate in my opinion. I think increasing from a half a serving to 6 servings of fermented foods a day is not easy or feasible for everyone, but could any amount of fermented foods help? And then the researchers performed this among healthy individuals. So I think it would be interesting to see this done in the context of mental health disorders or other inflammatory diseases. Strengths were that they used state-of-the-art technologies for microbiome sequencing and immune profiling. To be honest, I was having a hard time understanding what all of this meant when I was reading the studies, but they really seemed to care about these results. And then the results demonstrate the impact of the gut microbiome, or the impact of diet on the gut microbiome and the immune system. Conclusions of this study are that a high fiber diet may alter microbiome function and elicit a personalized immune response, and a high fermented food diet may increase microbiome diversity and decrease markers of inflammation. All right, this next study was done in Iran, and it was published in 2020. Okay, so the research question for this was, what effect do psychobiotics have on serum brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, in patients with low to moderate depression? Has anyone heard of BDNF? It's not a common nutrition term. So it is a protein found in the brain and the spinal cord, and it promotes the growth and survival of neurons. And low levels have been associated with various neuropsychiatric disorders. In the light of time, I won't go through all of these, but I think it's important to note that those included in the study had a current diagnosis of depression and were taking an SSRI antidepressant medication. Those excluded were obviously a lot of things. Basically, anyone who had lifestyle or health that could interfere with the results of the intervention, such as taking an antibiotic or being a smoker. This was a post hoc analysis of a randomized control trial in which the researchers did a statistical analysis of BDNF levels of participants in their cohort to determine the mechanism of action of the psychobiotic. Of the 110 patients randomized into a probiotic, prebiotic, and placebo group, 81 completed the trial and 78 were included in the analysis. Those in the probiotic group received a formulation of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Those in the prebiotic group received a galacto-oligosaccharide supplement. Those in the control group had a placebo, and all groups were encouraged to consume one supplement at the same time daily for 8 weeks, and blood samples were collected at the beginning and end of the trial. Looking at primary outcomes of this study, as seen in Table 2, post-intervention serum BDNF levels were significantly different between groups, and in Table 3, BDNF levels were significantly higher in the probiotics group as compared to the prebiotic and placebo groups. And then secondary outcomes were related to symptoms of depression. So as seen in Table 4, Beck's Depression Inventory, or BDI scores, which measures the severity of symptoms, were significantly different between groups from baseline to endpoint. And in Table 5, significant decreases in BDI scores or depression scores were only observed in the probiotic group compared to the placebo group. Another thing to note is that changes in brain-derived neurotrophic factor and depression scores were inversely correlated, with a stronger correlation in the probiotic group. So essentially, the higher the BDNF levels, the lower the depression scores, and vice versa. I gave the study a positive rating. There were definitely a lot of strengths when reviewing the research. One thing was that it was a randomized control trial with high compliance, which it was doable for the participants. So 91% of the supplements were consumed during the intervention. The researchers also sought to analyze the mechanism of action of the psychobiotic, which I thought was pretty impressive. And then the probiotic and prebiotic strains and types used in this study were previously found to be psychotropic in human and animal studies, and psychotropic just means having some kind of effect on mental state. Weaknesses were the relatively short intervention period, and they did not address intestinal microbiota composition or diversity, which could be really beneficial. The conclusion of this study is that supplementation with Lactobacillus helveticus and Bifidobacterium longum may improve depression symptoms, possibly by increasing BDNF levels. All right, the last study we will look at today was done in Australia and was published in 2017. This is a very popular study among those looking at mental health and diet. The research question was, will a Mediterranean-style diet reduce symptoms of depression? Those included in the study had to fulfill the DSM for a major depressive episode, which was having severe depressive symptoms for at least 2 weeks. They need to have scored a high score on this Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, which measured the severity of their symptoms. And they needed to have a low score on this dietary screening tool, which is called the Modified Mediterranean Diet Score. And that just means that the diet was high in processed foods and low in foods typically seen in the Mediterranean diet. Some exclusion criteria were having a concurrent diagnosis of bipolar disorder, current participation in another intervention, targeting diet or exercise, or having recently started a new psychotherapy or medication within the last 2 weeks. This was a randomized single-blind control trial. With most nutrition trials, the participants couldn't be blinded, just not possible. 67 eligible people were randomized into a dietary intervention group or social support control group, and at the end of 12 weeks, 56 were analyzed. Both groups received standardized care. They wanted to do things as similar as possible between groups, to as much as they could. So this was 7 individual support sessions, 60 minutes each over a 12-week period, all in the same location. The dietary intervention group received nutrition counseling from a clinical dietitian, which included things like motivational interviewing and dietary advice, all in order to support adherence to the recommended diet, which was a mostly plant-based diet with lean protein and dairy. They were encouraged to increase their consumption of plant foods, lean proteins, and fish, and decrease what they called extras, which were those things like processed foods, sugary beverages, and alcohol. It didn't mean they had to completely eliminate them, but it just meant eating more of those plant foods and decreasing the processed foods. Those in the control group underwent a befriending protocol in which trained personnel met with the participants individually and engaged in conversations or other things like board games, all with the intention of keeping the participants engaged and positive. This is often used as a control condition for clinical trials of psychotherapy. The dietary support group demonstrated significantly greater improvement in depression rating scores as compared to the control group at the end of the trial. In regards to diet, the dietary support group showed significantly greater improvement in modified Mediterranean diet scores compared to controls, as you'd probably expect, and then changes in the diet scores correlated with changes in depression symptom scores. Another interesting finding was that 33% of the dietary support group, a third of that group, achieved remission criteria of their depression symptoms at the end of the intervention. 8% of the social support group also achieved this criteria. I gave this study a neutral rating. Strengths were that it was a randomized control trial that demonstrated that making dietary changes can be effective in improving mental health, and the meal pattern was cost-effective, sustainable, and satiating. The researchers found that the cost of the diet they advocated for was actually less expensive than the baseline diets of the participant when looking at some comparisons there. Weaknesses were the small sample size. They were hoping to have at least 88 participants, but by the end of the trial, there were only 56. Participants could not be blinded, which may have led to possible expectation bias, knowing, well, maybe this diet will help me. And the researchers didn't identify any biological pathways. They did mention this kind of in the discussion, like we didn't look at any of these pathways, but it would be interesting to see that. So maybe in future studies, they will do that. And then the conclusion of this study is that a Mediterranean style diet may reduce symptoms of depression. All right, moving on to the significance. So my takeaways. I think that these clinical trials do lay the groundwork for research moving forward. There have been some studies replicated similar to the last study I talked about. So I think we just need more and more of these and maybe continue to look at some of the biological pathways involved to really see how diet can affect our mind. What we don't know is what exact amounts, portions, or species of gut microbes are ideal. But we do know that a diverse gut microbiome is favorable, and eating a variety of plant foods and fermented foods can encourage this microbial diversity. And then, what is the role of the dietitian? Some of you probably work in behavioral health settings, which you definitely get this experience there, but I don't think it's limited to that. Maybe you could meet in somebody's home or another outpatient setting or something like that. But the role of the dietitian is providing MNT, ensuring that resources are available to meet daily nutritional needs, and teaching how to incorporate foods so that the patient or client knows really how to eat those foods that they might be interested in consuming, like fermented foods, for example. And they're the food and nutrition experts, so I really think that they can help somebody with this. I don't think that we should place the responsibility fully on an individual, especially those with mental health issues. It's a struggle. So I think we need to look at the bigger picture. I think we should ask, are there gaps in our average diet, which I really think there are in the American diet? And then how do we strengthen food and nutrition infrastructure to ensure that foods that are good for our bodies and our brains are available? That is all I have. So here are my references. And if we have time, I can take questions. Thank you. Yes.
In that last study, did they have a protocol? How did they assess the participants' degree of adherence to the Mediterranean diet? Did they have them keep a food diet or anything like that? I'm curious.
Yes, they had to keep a food log. So, and they met with the dietitian. If I put how often? It was throughout the 12 weeks, and I know that they had to bring their food logs to the dietitian and assess kind of that compliance. Thank you.
In that last study, did it say anywhere the strategy of like maybe motivational interviewing that the dietitian utilized to get the training diets?
Yeah, that would be. They didn't go into detail about that, but they did mention that, you know, even if there wasn't a change in microbiome or anything like that, maybe it was just that motivational interviewing that helped increase, first of all, quality of life and maybe help the person set some goals and really successfully do the diet. But they didn't really go into kind of what they said or anything like that. But that would be, yeah, interesting. Anything else? Thank you.